Well, good morning. So good to see you this morning, and we are continuing, as Faith has just said, in our series on David, week 2 today. And we're going to enter into a story, or another part of David's story. And David is one who we know started off as a shepherd boy. God anointed him to be king, and eventually he did become king. So we kind of come to this narrative knowing how it ends. But we need to remember that actually in this, that David didn't know how it ended and how it started. So today, when we jump into this story, I want us to be reminded of something that is very relevant to all of us. You might be thinking it's not relevant to you today. Well, I can assure you at some point in your life it will be relevant, because for all of us we go through facing the giants that I'm going to be talking about this morning. And what we find is that the ways of God seem very unappealing. They can seem very unappealing when we are facing these moments in our life. And particularly the three giants I want us to look at, which are illustrated through David today, are the giants of anger, loneliness, and abandonment. And for all of us, at some point in our lives, we're going to find ourselves having these feelings, these emotions in our life, either through because people have either walked out of our life, we've been rejected in some way, there's something that's caused us to get angry. And these emotions cause us to do things that maybe naturally, that maybe become natural to us, but actually they are the wrong thing to do. Just because it's instinct doesn't mean that that's what we should do. So it's a little bit like if ever you're training to do something, so often when you're in training, so for example, like if you were wanting to learn to canoe, you have to learn that although when the canoe rocks, the last thing you should do is to put your hands on the side, because it actually causes it to be more unstable. So you've got to fight these instincts. And so David in this story, he finds himself with these emotions, and we see how he responds to these emotions, how he responds to them. And that's the issue for all of us, is that so often we end up doing the wrong thing as a result of the emotions that we are going through. What happens is we end up becoming angrier, we end up becoming more lonely, we become, the decisions that we make in this often complicate things. We think that it will make less complications or less problems or less difficulties, but as we'll find with David, things actually became very complicated. And I don't know about you, but I watch people who are generally very intelligent. You know, they've got it together in so much of their life, make some stupid mistakes because of these issues in this life. These three emotions cause people who otherwise make good choices to make bad choices. And just in case you're wondering, yes, I've made bad choices as well. And I know that each of you have made bad choices based on these emotions. So we're all in the same boat, understanding what this is happening. Now, the story of David is basically the issues with David that we particularly remember is that he made a colossal mistake later on in life. When he was king, he was famous for a colossal mistake. Well, I want to say to you today, we're going to look at a colossal mistake that he made that he's not famous for. That actually that we read through, but we don't actually remember. This takes place when David was about 22 years of age. And he's now grown up. He's fought Goliath, he's become famous. His notoriety in Israel is legendary. And he has become a key figure in the nation of Israel as a result of this. In other words, everybody knows his name. Everybody knows his exploits, and he ends up becoming in charge of the bodyguard of the king Saul, who was reigning at the time, was the first king of Israel. And he goes out and into battles, and as a result of these battles, he becomes even more famous. He becomes even more kind of, David, we like you in all that we're doing. However, the problem is that King Saul became jealous. He felt insecure in his kingship, and he knew that God had rejected him as king, and so he responded to this, and in so many ways, but particularly he was anti-David because he understood that David had been anointed to king. And so for him, and you can imagine, put yourself in that place, you think to yourself, you are king of the nation, and you would naturally want your son to become the heir of the kingdom. And so Saul was after this. This was what he was interested in. And so David was a threat to that, but then he thought to himself, well, actually, what I'll probably do, I think what would probably be a good move for me, is if I try to get David in the family, then I can control him. Now, I don't know if you've ever done that, try to get somebody in the family, get close and think you can control them. There are manipulators in life, aren't there? Some people try to manipulate us to get what they want. And so King Saul was doing this with David. And so he offered one of his daughters to David in marriage. But marriage for him wasn't something to marry this daughter wasn't something that he wanted. It says, and we read David's response, it says, I am not worthy to be the king's son-in-law, and my family's not a famous family or a rich family, so I don't think I'm worthy. Well, you know what happened with this? David was loved even more, because they thought he isn't trying to just get in with the king. He's not trying for position. He's not trying to get, prominence through being the king's son-in-law. And so they loved him even more. However, we find that David does fall in love with another one of Saul's daughters called Michal, or Michelle, however they pronounce it, and they get married. And so not only that, when he marries Michelle, he becomes really close friends with Saul's son called Jonathan. Yes? And so these two become the closest of friends. In fact, we find that for those of you that are reading the daily devotion that we're following as a church, we'll know that Jonathan and David's relationship was of immense closeness. They loved one another, not in a sexual way, but in a friendship way. They loved each other as they loved themselves. They made a covenant together. They made a pact together. And in fact, Jonathan recognizes that David will one day be king. Now, you imagine Jonathan being in that position, that he recognizes that it's about what God wants, and recognizes the call of God on David's life, and recognizes that he will not be king. But he talks about that and says, but I will be next to you when you're king. I will support you when you're king. I'll be second in command, as it were. I'll be alongside you. That's the kind of relationship. Now, you can imagine Saul, yes? And he's even more infuriated and frustrated with the process, because he's thinking, no, Jonathan, you need to be king. This guy is not to be king. So time goes by, and about 7 years as it is. And we find that through this time that David is in favor with the king, out of favor with the king, in favor with the king. And guess what? Out of favor. It's in, out, in, out. And that's the issue. In fact, at times, he got so upset with David, he would throw a spear at him. Now, I don't know about you, but I probably wouldn't hang around very long if somebody was throwing a spear at me. Seemingly Saul liked this way when he got angry, as we'll see in a little bit further. And so David thinks, okay, he's in the family, I can't control him in the family. So I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll send him on some missions. I'm going to send him to the enemy, and I'm going to give him impossible odds. I'm going to ask him to do things that, he's going to come back in a box. But you know what? Every time he went out, David defeated the enemy. He came back victorious. And even Saul would say, I get him more and more frustrated, thinking, what do I have to do to get rid of this guy? And so he would not only do that, he would send people to secretly arrest him because he wanted to kill him. The problem is that his daughter and his son both of them would protect David. They would do things to make sure that he was okay. So Saul would send men to go arrest David, and David would be off, and David's wife, obviously Saul's daughter, Michal, she puts a dummy in the thing, makes things up so it looks like he's there, and makes an excuse that he's poorly, and so David can escape. And all the time they're doing this, and so Saul is getting even more and more frustrated. Well, one of the things about this story is it culminates in mealtime. On one time when there's dinner. Now, dinner with the king was a big deal. It was an honor to be with the king. Now, David would normally have been seated at the table with the king and with the family. But because of Saul's kind of the in favor, out of favor, he often would miss and realize that actually that being there became more and more of a problem to him. And so Saul would say, where's David, to Jonathan? And Jonathan would, being a close friend, would make excuses for himself. Oh, he told me he had a mission to go. He had to go back to his family and this and that. And so he would try to cover for him. Well, this night, Saul has had enough. He's had enough. He thinks to himself, no more excuses. He realizes Jonathan is covering for him. His daughter Michelle's covering for him. There's also, he thinks, my family is conspiring against me. And so this is where we pick it up in chapter 20 of 1 Samuel, verse 30. It says, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman. I hope she wasn't in the room. Can you imagine if she sat there? Yeah, his mum? Not things. Now, it goes on, he says, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? I think that there must have been some marriage issues here. Now, it's understandable because they were able to marry lots of women. And if you've got lots of women in the same house, that's competition. It's going to be problems, yes? Because it's going to be who's the favorite wife. Yeah? So you can imagine, don't you? Anyway, we won't go down that line as much as I might be tempted to go. But verse 31 says this, as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you, this is what I'm saying, nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. He recognized that while David was alive, Jonathan would never succeed him to the throne. However, Jonathan finds David and warns David. In fact, this whole passage and narrative about this whole process of how Jonathan says, I'll find out if Saul's in favor, if he's in, because he gets upset, but then he's okay, and I recognize this. So I'll suss it out for you. And so as a result of Jonathan warning David, David has to leave town. Well, he had to leave the nation. He had to escape from that. And so because of Saul being fearful of David's reputation and what he was and who he would come, and because of his influence in the nation, David was on the run. David is afraid, he's alone, and he's been abandoned. He has been rejected by the very man, Saul, whom he defended with his life. Saul has been the one, he was the head of his bodyguard, he protected the king, he was key, he was married to his daughter, he was key. He was probably, as later on we find, probably the most loyal guy in Saul's household. And yet, he's on the run. He's been abandoned, he's isolated, he's angry, and he's afraid. And you know what he did? He did what many of us do. He panicked. And when we panic, we do stupid things, don't we? And so that's what he did. He took matters into his own hand. He lost sight of who God said he was. He lost sight of God's plan. He lost sight of the things that we were talking about last week. And so you can imagine, can't you, where is this David that we knew from last week? Well, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that where you've run away from a situation, you've been scared in a situation, you've felt rejected in a situation, and then afterwards, maybe like this morning, or you're thinking to yourself, yes, I remember when that happened, and I remember, and I think, why did I run away? Why did I act like that? Why did I do this? Why did I say that? We look back with hindsight and think, that was stupid. And I should have known it was stupid. In fact, I did know it was stupid. And yet I still did it. And so David enters into survival mode. He's into, I've got to survive. I've got to protect myself, because if not, I'm going to be killed. Now, of course, for you and I, we know how the story ends. But David doesn't. And we've got to remember that David is in this situation not knowing how things will pan out. Because you and I look at this and think, David, you're going to become king one day. What's the problem? You know, and so we do that. And so we look back on our life, and he looked back on his life, and I know he would have said, why did I do that? Why did I go there? And you may be asking, why did I call him, or why did I call her? Why did I do that? Why did I say that? As a result of this, because we felt abandoned, we felt rejected, we felt angry, and we felt alone. And so that's what David did. In Samuel 21, it says there, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Now, Jerusalem was not part of Israel at this point in time. So the epicenter of Jewish worship was wherever the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant was. And because of the way that Israel was, that the Ark was moved wherever it was safest in Israel. So wherever there was the most protected point, they would take the Ark there. And so naturally, that's where the priests were. Yes? So just having that in your mind, because you might be thinking, was it Jerusalem? Not at this point in time, it wasn't. And so at this point in time, the safest place was a place called Nob, and so that's where the priests were. And so it said this, David went to Nob to Ahimelech, the high priest, and it says, Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, why are you alone Why is no one with you? It's a strange one, isn't it, yeah? Because if I turned up at, another pastor's house down the road or something, you came to I wouldn't be thinking, why are you alone? But you've got to remember in the setting, David is in charge of the king's warriors. He's in charge of the body. In other words, when David came to visit you, you knew he was coming well before he ever arrived. You would hear him because he would have thousands of warriors with him. He didn't travel alone. He would normally, in other words, Ahimelech knew if David's coming, I can hear the horses. I can hear the commotion. And so he's saying, why are you alone? And so you can just imagine this. So you can imagine him, Ahimelech thinking, this doesn't seem right. Just doesn't what's going on here? And so David answered Ahimelech the priest. And we see now when David answers, he tells a lie. Is this the David of last week? He tells a lie. Yes, it says this. He says, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place, a secret place. They're hiding somewhere. Just there, yeah? And so he's like, now, I've got to realize, you've got to understand that David, that lying is in his top 10 principles of things that he knows he's not to do. Yes? In fact, when he's talking about that, he's gone to where the Ark of the Covenant is. It's where the 10 Commandments are kept, so the original document with the thou shalt not is in the presence of it, and yet here he is forgetting the very basic. He's a Jewish guy, he understands this, and yet he has chosen at this point, because he is afraid, abandoned, and alone, he is lying. He had no men, but he was afraid that Ahimelech would not help him if he knew this. But I want to say to you, this lie cost Ahimelech and his family and all the people that lived nearby their lives because of David's lie. Verse 3, now then, what do you have in hand? Do you have it on hand, says David. Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. Ahimelech's thinking to himself, hang on a minute, you're on your own, your men are in hiding somewhere, and you smell like you've been, not had a wash for 3 days, you have no food, you're hungry, it just doesn't make sense. It's got to be something that he's thinking, this is weird. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. Maybe there's something in there that you need to do a study on. But anyway, the whole thing behind this was the bread was put on the altar, was consecrated to God. And I think the idea probably was that maybe it was for God to eat through the night or something, I don't know. But of course it wasn't eaten. God didn't need to eat it. But it was done in honor of God. And so the next day they would bake fresh bread, and so they'd take that bread off. And so this was classed as holy bread. And so you had to be consecrated yourself to be able to have this. And so we see here that David is now starting to work things out according to his plan, according to the way he sees things, and not according to the way God had designed for it. So the priest gave him the consecrated bread. In other words, he lied to be fed. And what happened? I don't know you, but what we had last week, in you, oh Lord, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. What happened to that, David? What happened to that? Well, the drama unfolds. David asked Ahimelech, do you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was urgent. Eh? It's not the king's mission is urgent. He's running for his life from the king. Now, I just want you to picture this here. That he is at a crux in his life. This should have, out of all the moments when he's on the run, this should have been the time when it should have been a wake-up call for David. He should have been able to see what, even if up to this point he hadn't seen, with what comes next. He should have been asking himself, why am I doing this? What's going to happen as a result of what I'm doing? Because in verse 9, this is I think the kind of the drama of the story. It says, the priest replied, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. If ever there was a massive picture that should have, like an object lesson that should have said to him, David, here is Goliath. The last time this sword was wielded by a warrior, the guy died. Because David killed the bearer of this sword. You see, after David had killed Goliath, he kept the sword as a souvenir. But then after a while, David gave the sword to the priest. He gave the sword into the tabernacle for to be kept. And he did it as a way of saying, Lord, I won this Goliath, but I did it because you were with me. I didn't do it in my strength and my skill. I did it because of you. So that's why I gave him. So you think David now being offered Goliath's sword that you would think, uh-oh, and the light would come on, would you not? Because of all that this means. It's not what it means to anybody, and anybody else in Israel, it would have had some impact. But to this is David, the giant slayer, and it's the slain giant sword, and you would think, he'd think to himself, it didn't work out well for the last guy that carried this sword. Why should it work out for me? He'd taken things into his own things. And so he should have understood and he should have reminded. So we ask ourselves the question, what happened to the clear-eyed, courageous, God-fearing 15-year-old boy that we were listening to last week, that we were talking about last week? The boy who said, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And this day, are you taking notes, Goliath? He's saying, this day I'm going to strike you down. I'm going to take your head from you. Then I'm going to feed all the carcasses of the host of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the field, so that the whole world will know there is a God. What happened to this young boy, we ask ourselves. Well, in chapter 17, we read there, it says, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. David spoke this to the very bearer of this sword that he's asking for. You'd think he'd kind of think, reminded, bring back memories, would you not? Is it just me? But you see, these three giants, he could face one giant, but three giants, these three giants have been alone, abandoned, and angry, were the ones that caused him, was the cause of his lack of faith in God, because he started to do things and say things out of instinct rather than because of his faith in God. In Samuel 21, it says this, the priest replied, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. And then then David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. Always, this is the problem when we get into such strong emotions as this, is we start to take matters into our own hands and start to think that we can do best by doing this. And you would think that this would have been something that was far too easy to miss. Now, I don't know about you, but what I find when I look back on my life is when I have gone into situations like this, when I felt alone or angry, when you felt like being rejected, I look back on my life and I think to myself that my situation is different. When I look at your life and I see the things that you're going through, I think to myself, well, do you not realize this happens to everybody? Everybody in some way or other goes through these same emotions, same things. There's nothing new. We all go through the same issues, maybe in different ways, different scenarios, but we all end up being rejected at some point. We all feel alone at some point. We're all afraid at some point. We all get angry at different, So we understand that. But what I find is that when it happens to me, it's different. And I know that you think the same. That's the problem is, when it's someone else, we think to ourselves, can't they just see? But when it's us, we think, but you see, this is what is different about my situation. And so we make a difference and we talk about those kind of things. And so this is what happens with David. He goes on from there after seeing Ahimelech, and he's on the run. And so he goes, guess where he goes with the sword of Goliath? I think this is really interesting. He goes to the Philistines, the very people that Goliath and that he killed. Yes? He goes to them. He goes to the leader, the king of the Philistines, and he's kind of, can I come and stay with you? And this guy, the king, goes, hang on a minute, isn't this David who has slaughtered many Philistines? In fact, not only does he just go to the Philistines, he goes to where the giant came from and his brothers. Isn't that amazing? He goes to Gath. So you're thinking to yourself, what planet are you on, David? And so the king thinks, I don't need him. And of course he realized then he's afraid again. And so then he starts to act like a madman. And he starts to scratch onto wood and all that kind of thing and drool and whatever. A bit like what I do on a normal day. But he's afraid and he's scared. And so he does that. And so he says, oh, get away with him. I don't need any more madmen. Must have had a lot of madmen in the Philistines, I don't know. But off he goes again. And so he disappears. And so he's in problems. And so eventually, David comes to his senses. And that's the day that we all need, isn't it? We need a day when we come to our senses. In the midst of being angry, abandoned, and alone, we need to come to our senses when these giants are facing us. And so he does do that. He comes to himself, and so he finds a prophet, and he says to the prophet, I've messed up, I've blown it, I've made this, whatever. And so that's what he does. But unfortunately, the damage has already been done. You see, because when he went to Ahimelech and was asking for the sword and was asking for some food, there was a guy there called Doeg, D-O-E-G, however you pronounce it. And he was a dog, no doubt about it. He was some dodgy dog. He was somebody who you wouldn't want to be there. And so he overheard the conversation that David and Ahimelech had, but he'd only half heard it. And so he ends up going to Saul and grassing Ahimelech up. And so he goes and he says to him, I overheard this conversation. And this is what he said. And so we see that in chapter 22, verse 10. It says, Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions. Oh, I've done that one, haven't I? It goes on. And so when he comes to his senses, David, he says that he's responsible and recognizes he's responsible for that. But Doeg says to Saul, I overheard, and Ahimelech helped David. He gave him the sword of Goliath, and he gave him some food, and so he's for David and he's against you, Saul. And so Saul sends for Ahimelech and for the whole lot of the priests. There's 85 priests come to all together. They come before Saul, and Saul says, what is this that you have done? You have sided with David, and because you've sided with David, I'm going to kill you. And Ahimelech says there's nothing to do with that. This is not the first time David has asked me to inquire of the Lord. He'd done it on a number of occasions, so it wasn't the first. And they're saying, well, surely to goodness, David is your most loyal subject. He's so faithful to you. Why would it be a problem for me to do this? But you see, Doeg had misinterpreted and was trying to get in with the king. Now, so King Saul asked for the soldiers to kill. He says, kill the priest, kill him and all that are here. But the soldiers refused to do that. They said, we're not going to kill it. That's, But Doeg, being a dog he is, he was willing to kill them. Saul says, you kill them. And so off he did, thinking he would get in King Saul's good books, he killed them. And then Saul said, now go kill all that are in that town as well. So this is all that happened because why? Because David took matters into his own hand, because he lied, and because of that. And it's so important for us to realize and to ask ourselves some really serious questions about this, because it's not just David that ended up in a mess. But you and I, when we do these things, when we're in these emotions, these major, giant emotions, we do things that don't just affect ourselves, they affect the people who are close to us. Yes, they affect the people that we love the most, and as a result of the things that we do. So I want us to briefly, as we come to a close, to think about how this story intersects with our lives, because it's common to all of us at some point in our life. Anger pushes us to do things that we wouldn't normally consider doing. So let me ask you some questions. Well, the first one is, what is your loneliness or your anger or your fear causing you to consider that you would not normally consider? It might be a relationship. It might be a financial decision. It might be going back to a habit that's broken. It could be any number of things that, because of the emotions that you're having, that is causing you to consider doing something that you wouldn't normally consider. The second question is very similar. It says, who is your anger or your loneliness or your fear causing you to consider that you know you should not consider? It's amazing when we are lonely that we consider to be with people that we wouldn't normally. Or because of our frustration, or because of our sense of rejection in one relationship, we then think about going to another relationship. You see, anytime we're in a relationship and we feel ignored, there's a potential for us to take things into our own hands and to do things the way that we would, and maybe to do things that we wouldn't normally consider doing. Another key question, I think, which comes from out of this story is, who, besides you, do your considerations put at risk? Who beside you is going to suffer the consequences of the decision that you are going to make? Because it's not just going to affect you, it's going to affect your family, it's going to affect your friends. It could depend what kind of decision it is going to affect you. It could affect you for many, many years as a result of this. Who else is at risk? Who else's future hangs in the balance because of your strong emotions? And no one's denying that these emotions are unbelievably strong. But I believe that we need to be like David, come to our senses, recalibrate, seek the Lord again and say, Lord, what do you want me to do? So even when we've blown it, ideally before we blow it, but we all know at some point in life we do blow it. We do things, we say things which we regret. But let's be like David that comes back and we're able to say, as he did in Psalm 9 verse 9, the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. He would write songs. He would be one of the most famous poets in history, all about his experiences. And so we read the Psalms as his journal, that we get to see his thoughts on this. And in verse 10 of Psalm 9, he says, those who know your name trust in you. For you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. David trusted when it was Goliath, but then lacked trust and did some stupid things that cost many lives when he felt alone, abandoned, and angry. And you and I will do exactly the same things unless we recognize this and we turn to the Lord. What I find amazing more than anything else is that an ancestor of David, thousands of years later, in the same nation and in a very similar way, David's most famous descendant, who was only born a few miles actually from the city of David, would look into the eyes of frightened, overtaxed, seemingly abandoned Israelites, and he would say this, come to me. Come to me. He put himself in the place of God. He said, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. Come to me, you who are fearful, abandoned, and anxious and angry, because in me you will find rest. In me you will find purpose and destiny. In me you will find protection. And so today, as we come to sing a final song, I want us just to think about that. I pray that as you leave today, that you will just analyze this in your life and think, how can I make some decisions today? How can I put some things in place that will help us in those situations? Maybe today you need to return to the Lord. Maybe you've been through some situations and you're thinking, today I realize that those situations, those decisions I've made have caused massive issues in my life. And we can't change those. David couldn't bring the priests back to life and their families. But he could say, today I'm going to trust the Lord. Today I'm going to do what's right. Today I will walk in that path. My question to you today is, will you do that? Will you take your refuge in Jesus? Will you come to Jesus today, wherever we are, in our circumstances, our situations, in wherever our emotions are? Will we come to Jesus? Because he is the one who will enable us, whatever our emotions, to do and to say the right thing. Amen.